Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? On Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo's Arabian Nights on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Monster of Mexico on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Pirates Ahoy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's What's New Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? On Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's a pup named Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network.
Skunk Fu is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Skunk Fu on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the League of Super Evil on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Stoked on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Star Wars: The Clone Wars on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's an all-new Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's The Secret Saturdays on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's a new episode of The Secret Saturdays on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Hot Wheels Battle Force 5 on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Batman, Mystery of the Batwoman on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Casper's Scare School on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Garfield Fun Fest on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Home Alone 3 on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Scooby-Doo, The Mystery Begins on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans, Trouble in Tokyo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Open Season on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Adventures in Babysitting on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scary Godmother 2, The Revenge of Jenny on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door, only on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Chaotic on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Beavis and Butthead on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Johnny. Coming up on Cartoon Network, regular stuff.
Up next, it's Corn Puff on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Family Guy on the Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Augie and the Cockroaches on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Sliced on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Unikitty on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Uncle Grandpa on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Matt on Cartoon Network.
Up next, it's Final 5 Fosters on Cartoon Network. Next, Final 5.
Up next, it's Making Fiends on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Squirrel Boy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Evil Con Carne on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Cow and Chicken on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Underfist Halloween Bash on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Whatever Happened to Robot Jones on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Steven Universe on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Uncle Grandpa on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the League of Super Evil on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Bakugan Battle Brawlers on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Sheep in the Big City on Cartoon Network.
Up next, it's Rhythm Heaven Fever on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's a new episode of The Secret Saturdays on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Robotomy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network. Coming up next on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's the Superhero Squad Show on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's an all-new Johnny Test on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Billy's Birthday Shorties on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Mr. Peabody and Sherman.
Coming up next,
It's Adult Swim.
on Cartoon Network.